Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I imagine that, especially if you're on the front line, you've got an enormous amount to do today, so really appreciate your time. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss the roles and challenges faced by emergency duty team workers who are in a vital but often overlooked and very much misunderstood service as well. So I count myself in this when I say that many daytime workers, social workers and professionals aren't always fully aware of the role and remit of EDT. And this lack of knowledge can really contribute to a lot of confusion, inappropriate referrals and so on. So the purpose of this webinar is to really raise awareness about the role of EDT, to clarify the purpose and so on. So as part of this webinar, I'm very excited to announce that we'll be launching a survey we conducted alongside the EDT London Managers Forum. This is something that everyone here that you can see today contributed to. We launched it with a view to better understanding resource shortfalls, issues faced by staff, as well as how the service coped during the pandemic, which we all know was a time of unimaginable hardship for many of you. So we'll be sharing the key findings and recommendations during this. The link to that document will also be available in the chat, and you should have received it via email. If there's any issues there, please do just type in the chat and we can get that sent out. So do feel free to browse that at your leisure during this webinar. As the professional officer for this work, I just want to say it's been so rewarding working in co-production with the EDT London Managers Forum. Every single person here today has brought so much wisdom and insight and experience, and the report wouldn't be what it is without them. So I'd like to thank every single person who contributed. We also know that you're so busy, so if you did take the time to fill out the survey, again, huge thank you. So I just want to start by sharing the key findings from the survey. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So the survey demonstrated that 89.5% of social workers had experienced issues with the availability of placements during the pandemic, which is overwhelming. And I'm sure that many of you here are not at all surprised to hear that result. Next, we had 78.3% had experienced issues with placements actually refusing to accept clients. And at a time of increased vulnerability and increased instability for many children and families and vulnerable adults, that statistic really speaks for itself. If we could go on to the next slide, please. 69.4% of social workers had witnessed an increase in inappropriate referrals, which is again part of the reason that we decided this webinar and this report was so important, was to really help practitioners who are already very stressed and under pressure understand what is and isn't an appropriate referral. Next slide. 55.9% of respondents said their well-being had decreased or significantly decreased since the pandemic began. We all know that social workers go above and beyond day in, day out to do their best, and in normal circumstances that can be extremely challenging. So I think to receive this result was really quite concerning. So this is something that the panelists will be addressing as well. If we could go on to the next slide, please. 58.7% of respondents only had one member of staff on duty overnight. So just to clarify, so this is talking about past midnight until the day service opens. That is an enormous amount of responsibility for one staff member has. So you'll see in the recommendations later on, that is something that the panelists will address as well. Next slide, please, if we can. We had 40.8% said their well-being had not been supported well or at all during the pandemic. It goes without saying this is really concerning. Social workers need, are pillars of support to many people in the community, but without really being strengthened and supported themselves, that becomes really difficult. Next slide, if we can. 1 in 6 participants said that they did not have access to a duty manager at all times. That is again quite a shocking statistic, and I think everyone here can agree that that needs to be the bare minimum. So that's something again that the panelists will speak to later on. 50.7% experienced limited availability of staff due to underlying health concerns or shielding. We know that the pandemic has really had a huge toll on the availability of staff. And so again, this kind of highlights a huge gap and a huge area of concern that would need to be addressed in any future emergencies or pandemics. Next, we had 68.8% said COVID-19 had made their role more challenging or far more challenging. And again, I'm sure that will not be a surprise to anyone here. Final 2 points. 67.4% said PPE had hindered their ability to communicate effectively with service users. And the last point is 64.4% did not receive training on how to correctly use PPE. So again, that's just a snapshot of the key findings from this survey, highlighting really the key points that the panelists will be addressing throughout. Just very quickly want to touch on what support was available during COVID as well. So if we could go on to the next slide. So when we asked participants to kind of share, the support that was available during COVID-19, these were the main answers. So you can see here in the word cloud, we've got everything from vaccination to food parcels to shelter. So we can see there was a real focus on that tangible, practical support. But we had many common answers included none or no. So again, we really need to look at contingency planning and how to improve working conditions moving forward as well. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. Our National Director could not be here today, but she wanted to just give her thanks. So just very quickly, BASWA England would like to thank all EDT social workers who continue to give their all day in, day out in increasingly uncertain and challenging conditions. We recognise the enormous efforts made by dedicated, hard-working EDT social workers to fulfil their duties under both the Mental Health Act 1983, Children's Act and Care Act during the COVID-19 pandemic. EDT social workers, alongside colleagues, have given so very much during a period of unimaginable hardship and have made personal sacrifices to meet the complex needs of those they support. The adaptability, creativity and compassion of such social workers is an example to us all and has been a shining light to those who receive services. So from the bottom of our heart, thank you so much for everyone here, for everything that you do day in and day out. Just going to talk through very quickly the practicalities of the webinar. So as we progress through the webinar, we really want to hear from you. I know that online there'll be many EDT workers with everything from a day to decades of experience. So we really want to hear your thoughts. There's no such thing as a silly question. At the end, we will have a 15-minute period for question and answers. So we've got some lovely panelists, as you can see on the screen, who will be there to answer that. And again, if you want to dip into the survey report at any time, you can feel free to do so as well. You can use the chat question box to get in touch, so you should be able to see that on the right-hand side. And we're really encouraging anyone who's on Twitter to use that during the session. You can use 2 hashtags, which are on the left-hand side of the slide below. The first one is hashtag EDT social work. And the second one is hashtag EDT service BASWA. So again, for anyone who might have just missed the first 5 minutes, just to really clarify, the aim of today is to raise awareness about the remit and the role of EDT services, to provide a time really to critically reflect on the key challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic, and also present some of the findings. We did a survey of 138 EDT practitioners from diverse backgrounds all across the country, and much of the learning is from that research as well. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Linda, and Linda is a service manager at the London Triborough Emergency Duty Team. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Rebecca, and Good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to see such a healthy turnout for today. So what I will be focusing on is the golden question: what is EDT? Those three letters which roll off the tongue so easily, I'm sure is a part of the deluge we face a lot of the time. But in all seriousness, EDT is known up and down the country in various forms and guises. So I think primarily in London, we are aware of it as being the emergency duty team. However, it is known as emergency duty services, out of hours services, extended hours services also. So there are, differing names that are used about our emergency service that are used up and down the country. However, the main features are that, we share a lot in common, irrespective of the names used. So EDT, what do we do? So EDT is a duty service that provides an emergency social work response. It's primarily a service for vulnerable adults and children that starts from 5 p.m. through to 9 a.m. in the weekday, and at 24 hours at the weekend and bank holidays. Often, as already identified by Rebecca, EDT staff are lone workers after midnight, and they're responsible for providing emergency response to a large population, probably, potentially over a wide area. The research survey advised that 58.7% of EDT staff work on their own after midnight. Mistakenly, many believe that EDT is manned by a staff team that is commensurate with the day services team configuration, which is obviously not the case at all. Also interestingly identified by Rebecca, she had advised us that 15.7% of those lone workers at night don't have access to a duty manager. Next slide, please, Lisa. Oh, no, I think we'll be okay for the time being, yeah. As an EDT social worker, it's a very challenging task, and it relies upon experienced and skilled practitioners. EDT social workers are responsible for supporting a large population out of hours. So in my example, and I do appreciate this is more of a London bias, but I think it's even exacerbated by those who work in shires and counties as to the area that they cover and the population that they cover. So potentially in the tri-borough that I work, we cover Hammersmith and Fulham, Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster. That's a combined residential population of approximately 560,000. That's not including the visitors that will come into these three areas, which can go up as far as to 1 million at any one given time. In addition, we know that our colleagues in other areas of London also experience more complex issues owing to the resources that are within them. So let's say we have London Borough of Croydon, which will have the Home Office in there. And we also then have Hillingdon, who also have Heathrow Airport. So that also impacts upon the work and the role of EDT social workers. Just see, maybe the next slide, please. So where do our referrals come from? Our referrals come from our internal stakeholders. So that can be in the guise of children's front door services, looked after children's teams, children with disabilities, children with special educational needs, and CAMHS referrals. Adult social care referrals come in the guise of adult mental health, learning disabilities, older adults, and sensory impaired adults also, and children. In addition, we also receive referrals from our housing partners who have concerns about their residents. And that can bring a whole wealth of problems and unknown issues for clients who are living alone. When looking at our external stakeholders, our referrals for children and adults can come from the NHS, in the guise of the London Ambulance Service, emergency departments, general hospital wards, health-based places of safety for Mental Health Act assessments, mental health community treatment teams, and last but no means least, we receive many referrals from the police. The scope of assistance required from internal and external stakeholders is usually around Mental Health Act assessments, no replies, which is about older adults, vulnerable adults who are in receipt of care packages but not responding to those. Housing, so again, having to house vulnerable adults on an emergency basis. Identifying emergency placements, sourcing care packages, supporting victims of domestic abuse, undertaking adult safeguarding referrals, and so on. The list is by no means exhaustive. However, it does represent the work undertaken by EDTs in London and similarly up and down the country. That our remit is vast and wide. The work of EDT is often underpinned by EDT's response to statutory duties. So our statutory duties are governed by legislation such as the CARE Act 2014, the Children's Act 1989, Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, and the Mental Health Act 1983. Given our statutory duties, EDT demands staff to be highly skilled in prioritising their work. As often the demand for our assistance often outweighs our ability to be in more than one place at any given time. This challenge can sometimes lead to discord with our partners, with our stakeholder partners. I will now hand over to Balfour Mohammed and Deborah Palmer, who will share how EDT services manage the expectations of our interface partners.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Can we just go to the managing expectations slides there, Lisa, please? I think we need the other slides there. I think it's going further, it's going a bit further down. Perfect, that's it, great. Hi also, yeah, my name's Balfour Mohammed. I manage the emergency duty team in Brent, and I'm going to do this segment of the presentation today with my colleague Deborah. I know it says Jennifer there as well. Jennifer is going to join us and come in at another point. So I think there is going to be some, what we're going to talk about today, there's going to be some overlap with some of the things that Linda stated. But I think the reason why we're looking at this particular segment and this particular aspect of the work that we do is because this is quite a significant part of the work that EDT managers are involved in, which is basically managing the expectations of various individuals, which I will come to, and having to give a balance, if you like, to what those expectations are in the realms of what is the actual reality of what the service is able to provide. Can we just go to the next slide, Lisa, please? So I thought we'd start by looking at an explanation of what it means to manage an expectation. So it says to seek to prevent disappointment by establishing in advance what can realistically be achieved or delivered by a project, undertaking, course of action, etc. So, as I said before, it's quite an important part of what we do in terms of managing expectations. And it's, as it says from the statement there, it's really a preventive and preemptive task that we're engaged in. Typically, I think for many of us as managers, we will be involved in anticipating referrals and actually addressing referrals either before the start of a shift or actually at the beginning when the shift starts, and that's in order to really make sure that Referrers are able to understand what the basis of EDT's response and what therefore can be an alternative plan of action, so that the referrer is not left hanging without a response to their referral, and also they're able in time to be able to figure out and consider an alternative response. So that's quite an important part of what we do. Next slide. Linda touched on this earlier on in terms of who are the people who are the referrers. So we will receive referrals from both internal agencies, external agencies, and obviously members of the public who will call us directly. I think for myself, and I think it's the same for my colleagues, a large part of our referrals that we will be dealing with in terms of managing expectations will be from internal agencies, typically children's services and other agencies. So I've just given you just a couple of examples below of what I wouldn't say it's an inappropriate referral, because I think a part of what we are trying to do when we're managing expectations is to actually dispel some myths that I think exist with regards to people's understanding of what the emergency duty team does. And I know these myths exist because I had those same beliefs myself before I actually got involved in EDT. And it can range from people thinking that EDT is which we will touch on later on, it's a continuation of day services, or it's a group of people who are sitting at home who without very much to do, or whatever that may be. So here's a couple of examples. So we might receive a email or a phone call to say, can you call Mrs. Bloggs to make sure they're okay? Now, on the face of it, that seems a reasonable request. That's fine. However, and following on from the next one as well, which says, Mr. Bloggs, can you get hold of him? Can you do a welfare check? Again, that seems a reasonable request. However, from an EDT perspective, first and foremost, it's an emergency service, and that's a key element in the word emergency. It means that we're there, the service is there designed to respond to emergencies as they arise on the night. And I think, as was said earlier also, most EDT services are manned or personed by one person on duty, basically covering the whole borough. That means that they're not really in a position to respond to what is effectively a planned request, because the likelihood is that Mr. or Mrs. Bloggs will not be somebody who has just emerged out of the ether where suddenly a crisis has arisen. It will be a carryover from the day services, or it will be a response to a crisis that has already taken place earlier on during the course of the day, and it's carried over into the evening or the weekend. The reason why EDT services will be not wanting to respond to this service in the way that might be expected is because, for example, were that call to be made to Mrs. Blogg, Mr. Bloggs, the likelihood is if something else emerges out of that telephone call, that EDT worker will then be having to prioritize and to look into the needs of that particular person as it's emerged as a result of that phone call, as a result of that response. And that then means that that person is now not able to respond to an emergency that may arise as a result of the normal, typical duty shift. So the response there is likely to be that to have a conversation, to have a discussion with the referrer to say, can you think of other ways in which you might be able to respond to this particular situation, to this particular crisis? Now, that can sometimes cause some tensions with colleagues, with other services, because as we talked about earlier, their understanding or their expectations of what EDT does is not matching the reality. Next slide, please. So this part I'm going to pass over to my colleague Deborah to look further into why there is a mismatch between the expectation and the actual reality of the services. Deborah?
Thank you, Balfour. Okay. Why is there such a mismatch between what is expected and the reality? Fundamentally, I think we've heard that it's because there's a lack of understanding of what ET does or should do. And oh, I've lost my slides. 1 second. Yes. So it's known that it's known that there's an expectation that all referrals that are made to EDT will be accepted, which is not the case. EDT is fundamentally to safeguard for the weekend or until the next working day. So we can't deal with all referrals that are put through to EDT, and particularly those that are which we considered not to be an emergency. And we also deal with cases on a priority basis. So you've heard that EDT is manned by a single worker. Are you hearing me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. You've heard that EDT is manned by a single worker past midnight, and the idea of them dealing with 20 referrals is not so. So basically they have to prioritize the cases. There's an expectation sometimes that EDT will take over at the close of at 5 o'clock. That is a very common thing. Again, it's because of lack of understanding of what we actually do. And I think we've heard that, when you say ED team, people think that it's a team of people, when in fact it's oftentimes a lone worker. So there's often an assumption of accepting referrals for planned work. As we've heard, and we keep plugging, EDT is not an extension of the day services. So planned work cannot be defined as an emergency. The belief that incomplete work or tasks that run over into the evening will automatically be handed over to EDT is not sufficient justification for an assumption of automatic acceptance of a case. Again, that is a common theme. That EDT is an extension of the full range of services is not so. As we've heard, it's a single person managing. We don't have access to out of hours. We don't have access to, so like the housing database, for instance, or we do have access to the police, of course, who we often work in conjunction with in a collaborative way. So oftentimes we just have to hold the situation until the next working day. Bear with me. So EDT, as I said, we deal with the element of urgent distress, and we uphold the local authority's statutory responsibilities under the Mental Health Act, Child Care Act, Community Care Act, and other welfare acts. What can we do to manage the expectations? Will we ever achieve these expectations? I'm going to pass you back to Balfour.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. Okay, so what can we do to manage these expectations? Will we ever achieve this? I think for most of us, as I've said, as it says here, the challenge is to continuously inform referrers that the request, the task requested, is not within our remit. So essentially, the challenge, one of the expectations, how we can manage expectations, is really to continue to do what we do at the moment, which is to frequently engage with colleagues, I think with members of the public and external bodies. That's an ongoing thing. But as I said earlier, the predominant basis of our referrals are from internal agencies, colleagues. So the task really for us is to be very clear with regards to what we do and don't do, to be able to manage that request and that referral safely and jointly with our partners and colleagues, and to be clear with regards to what we do and don't do. It is going to be and will be an ongoing task, because as you can imagine, there's a turnover of staff. then you may get to a point where most of your colleagues, your other services and agencies within your local authority, they have that understanding of what your service does. However, a turnover of staff means that you will need to repeat that, and it's an ongoing situation. I think it's very important. We believe it's quite important, clearly, to be able to have regular lines of communication with colleagues and to keep those lines of communication open, continuously engage with one another with regards to what our services do, and equally for EDT services to understand what their colleagues do and what the way in which they manage their work base, so that we can have dialogue that is open, that is efficient, and that has a good outcome for the people who are actually there to provide a service for, as in members of the public. So that's quite an important thing. So as it says at the end, really, that then there's a need for clear protocols for all of our stakeholders, and I think that's something that is, as you said, is ongoing. Next slide, please. So challenges going forward. I think most of us here will be aware that there's a huge task currently and ahead in terms of the mental health arena. Well, there's increasing demand as a result of increasing number of people using mental health services, both pre-pandemic, currently within the pandemic, and likely to be going forward as well. And I think one of the things that was touched on earlier, which I just want to draw attention to, is specifically in the area of mental health, and specifically Mental Health Act assessments, that we might that we will need to continuously inform our mental health colleagues, service users and their families, that it may actually be, as is an undertaking and what is deemed as good practice in a Mental Health Act assessment and under the code of practice, is that it may actually be necessary in order to, for the benefit of primarily the individual, the service user, is that a Mental Health Act assessment may actually need to be paused in order to get the most beneficial outcome. Now, that might not sit well with our colleagues, because they may deem that as being inappropriate. So, for example, if you've had a request to do a Mental Health Act assessment, the example here is a request to go and see a patient at 2, 3 in the morning. I think it's fair to say that most of us are not at our best if we're woken up at 2 or 3 in the morning. If you are in the middle of a mental health crisis, that is probably even more so the case. So a request may be received to go and attend and see somebody at 2 or 3 in the morning, and quite rightly, the referrer wants the AMP to attend, conduct the assessment, and to move things forward. However, it's also the responsibility of the AMP to think in terms of what is the best outcome and what's going to be the most achievable and the most appropriate. And sometimes, not in all cases, but in some cases, it might actually be a requirement for the AMP to say, actually, I'm going to pause that, because it's not going to be beneficial for the person, for the service user, to be woken up at that time of the morning. So why don't we agree to pause this referral, and let's look at this in a couple of hours during the course of the EDT shift, or perhaps for the daytime colleagues to then pick up when that person's had a chance to rest, and you might actually have a completely different presentation. So I think that's quite important. But actually also, as a result of the understanding and the prioritizing of the EDT worker, that might not sit well with our colleagues. So again, going back to what I said before, lines of communication are very, very important, so that we both understand from both sides what it is that we're trying to achieve.
Can I come back in?
Yes, by all means.
Just to say that obviously the different services have different pressures. A&E are bound by a 4-hour window. I've forgotten the term of it now. And also the police want to move people on from the cells once a mental health assessment has been undertaken. One of the challenges is that if the person has been out of area, the bed is not always forthcoming, so that can cause a delay, which puts a pressure on the AMP to move the patient on. Also, one of the most important things to say is about the chronic psychiatric bed shortage, which entails oftentimes a repeat assessment of an individual, and that can be 2 or 3 times the person has to be reassessed. Sometimes it takes up to 4 days to find a bed. So that's another challenge and another pressure that's placed on all services, not just EDT, but A&E, ED departments and the police as well. The bed shortage, I believe, is across London. Well, I'm based in London, so that I know that there is a chronic bed shortage, and it has an impact not just for us as professionals, but also for the service users who are having to, and I would use the word languish, in unsuitable places. So, and then the challenge of balancing children with adult work and mental health work is also a big issue. Children will always take precedence, priority, by virtue of being children. So sometimes, again, there's a pressure to balance the work between having to rush out to do an assessment and safeguarding the child. And as I said, children are always paramount. Safety of children are always paramount. Balfour, do you want to conclude?
Thanks, Deborah. I would just end before we move on to the next segment in terms of what are the challenges going forward. I think most of us in the of my colleagues that are here today are managing services that are continuously trying to look at how best to service the residents of their borough and residents of other boroughs who come into the area. And as was touched on by Linda earlier, EDT services currently come in various forms and guises. Some have provide a generic service, such as what my authority provides. Some have a separation between children's services and adults. Some are and they're all in different ways and different forms. And the challenge going forward is going to be what those services look like and how they may manifest in their various forms, all for the purposes of trying to provide the most beneficial and ideal and appropriate service for the people who we choose to serve and that we are serving. So, and with legislation coming, as we have a new Mental Health Act that will be with us. There'll be other legislation that we're having to sort of address during the course of our service delivery. And if we're local authorities are constantly looking at restructuring, looking at rejigging, looking at ways in which they may tailor their services to meet the needs of the people who we're choosing to serve, and which is always going to be quite a significant challenge and in the future. So that's going to be something that we're going to be, I know that we're in the midst of as we speak and will be in going forward. So I'll end there. And I'll hand you over now to my colleague Ritu. Thanks very much.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. I am going to talk about the impact of pandemic and the resources challenges for the out of hours and EDT services. I'll start with saying the quote that as the Titanic was sinking, the band kept playing. So I consider the out of hours services were one of the services that actually carried on whilst the others were affected more by the pandemic. So on 11th of March 2020, the World Health Organization declared novel coronavirus infection, COVID-19, a global pandemic. No one was prepared for it, and it has since become a human and healthcare disaster where we went from social integration as a concept to emphasizing the importance of social distancing. Words like spread of infection, the R number, self-isolation, ventilators, ICU, quarantine, and lately vaccination have become the part of our common day use. Government briefings told us of the numbers of infected cases and daily deaths and how strategies to deal with them were developing and constantly changing at a very fast pace. The direct and indirect impact felt till today across the world has put pressures on health infrastructures and economic well-being of states and that of individuals. There has been information overload, some helpful, other conflicting, confusing, and lacking scientific basis. But we've all been there, that it's been an evolving picture. The lockdowns and other restrictions had an impact on people's mental health due to poor physical health, being stuck indoors, lack of recreational activity, eating out, meeting friends and families, holidays, and bereavement. The fear of catching the virus at times played on people's paranoia and anxiety. It magnified every single existing inequality in our society. For existing social care service users, access to intervention changed in most instances from in-person to a phone call or video call. Where there was any face-to-face contact, this was with the use of a mask or other PPE hindering effective communication. Emergency social workers were one of the limited community social care professionals, as I said before, who were involved in face-to-face work, directly dealing with adults and children safeguarding. I mean, I personally remember walking through the doors of A&E or health-based place of safety, police stations, or someone's home to carry out an emergency assessment, where some people were not.
Oh, sorry, Riti, we can't hear you all of a sudden. Would you mind just triple checking that you're definitely not muted?
Apologies. Can you not hear
you're
me?
back now.
Yes,
You're
we
back
can hear
now.
you.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure where I got muted.
Oh, it was just the last 10 seconds or so.
Okay. So I mean, what I was talking was about my experience of going into high-risk situations where some of our colleagues either were not using the PPE or social distancing according to the government guidelines, or it was at times not possible because there was a group of people involved in carrying out a mental health act assessment in a small cubicle in A&E. But this obviously caused enormous anxiety returning home to my family and exposing them to potential risks of infection. Some of the information, I must say, that is actually overlapping in all of our presentations, so please forgive me for that. There was an increase in referrals for families who were vulnerable and at risk of not being able to access food, medication, and other support, and required advice to be signposted to other appropriate agencies who could meet their needs. The survey indicated an increase in 64.9% of inappropriate referrals to the EDTs and out-of-hour services, closure of schools and some special educational needs establishment, daycares that were working at a lower capacity or closed altogether, made it a challenge to monitor the safeguarding concerns for the children and adults and giving families respite from their caring responsibilities. There were first presentations of people to social care who never had any other vulnerability, with the single most reason behind being the impact of the pandemic, including an increase in incidents of domestic violence and mental health breakdowns. There was an incidental change. For example, if I talk about my borough, I work in Hillingdon and we cover Heathrow Airport. At the initial start of the pandemic, there was a slight dip observed in lowering of the number of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children coming through the port, but it's quickly picked up with the other referrals from the community and the unaccompanied minors have, for the last few months, the numbers have been back up, specifically from Hong Kong, where there has been political unrest. Any service provision, as we know, is dependent on its workforce. There was approximately 50.3% shielding and clinically vulnerable staff, making service delivery a fine act of balance. It came with a need for robust risk assessments, not exposing staff to potential risks, and equipping them with the necessary tools for remote working, including appropriate use of PPE and guidance for its safe use. There was a disparity across the authorities in what was considered adequate protection and the level of support that followed. Management and team working in such situations were tested to its limits, but the resilience and goodwill with ethics of social care profession that guide us helped us to get through the most critical times. If I talk specifically about some of the resources which improved or which became more challenging during that time, then it's always true that any difficulty brings with it an opportunity to manage the challenge and development of strategies to prepare us for the future challenges. The pandemic brought us closer in terms of adult and children's social care supporting the out-of-hours services. There was greater management support available. The teams organized regular catch-up briefings with the staff and head of services, initially weekly, and then the frequency became less as the initial systems were put in place. There was availability of day service staff offering to cover and support the EDT. There was more availability of sessional staff, and support was offered in many boroughs with the transportation. The partner agencies, for example, domestic violence services, IDWA, brokerage, and community-based services also stepped up to support with food and medication delivery to support the delivery of the statutory social care services during the pandemic. The survey result indicates that 58.7% of EDTs work as generic single-person service. Generic social workers are difficult to recruit, and there is a national shortage of approved mental health professionals. During the pandemic, there was shortage of fostering and residential placements for children due to providers being worried about infection spread and quarantine requirements. Respite placements for people with learning difficulties, older people, and mental health became further difficult, where 89.5% reported difficulty in sourcing various placements. There was an increase in request for new enhanced and emergency domiciliary care packages, whereas the workforce was already shrinking due to staff either having to self-isolate or they were exposed to a person who was COVID positive. A single most difficulty, even pre-pandemic, as my colleagues have already highlighted, was sourcing beds for service users with mental health difficulties requiring hospital admission, often as detained patients under the provision of the Mental Health Act. The CCGs are responsible for providing beds for admission along with the NHS Mental Health Trusts under the Section 140 of the Mental Health Act. Lack of beds often create a bottleneck of patients waiting for a bed in A&E, health-based place of safety, police station, and community settings, resulting in handovers to be completed these assessments between day and out-of-hours services. The experience can sometimes be traumatic for the service users and can impact on the outcomes negatively. Pressures from A&E to complete assessments to prevent their breach of time is not necessarily in the spirit of the Mental Health Act. AMPs need to consider all relevant backgrounds, a thorough assessment with interviewing patients in a suitable manner, looking at the safe alternatives to admission, and the risk is that everything is being rushed in such instances. Due to pressure on ambulance services, a number of trusts depended on using private secure ambulances during the pandemic to transport the patients from assessment units to the admitting hospitals. It took a while for all of us to start using the electronic forms or applications for admission, and not all providers were set up with the same level of technical support in using the online processes. Some mental health trusts created hubs outside A&Es for people awaiting Mental Health Act assessments, but this varied across the authorities and posed its own challenges in terms of staffing and logistics in operating them effectively. Section 12 doctors, as we need them for completing any Mental Health Act assessments, made themselves available, but unfortunately some got struck with the virus themselves or had to self-isolate because of exposure to a person who was tested positive for a COVID infection. Although the government had stopped any housing evictions and supported families with rent arrears, we did receive requests for emergency housing under Section 17 of the Children's Act and under provisions of the CARE Act as well. It poses its challenges, and some local authorities have been developing services for residents with no recourse to public funds. For the authority that I work with in Hillingdon, it's been what I can say is we're going through transition at the moment. We're separating from being a generic service to more specialist service, where we will be separating between children and adult services. It's both exciting as well as challenging, if I'm allowed to say so. But I look forward to seeing how the service develops and hope that it can provide the necessary and appropriate services to the residents we serve. I will now hand you to Jennifer, who's going to talk around the issues of welfare during the pandemic. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. As Ritu, Deborah, Balfour and Linda have spoken, we've spoken about EDT in general, what we do and some of the issues which has faced us during the pandemic. So Marshall B. Rosenberg says, welfare, our survival as a species depends on our ability to recognize that our well-being and the well-being of others are in fact one and the same. For Harrow Council, we have a staff well-being and home working guidance, and this states good well-being is fundamental to our health and help us to make good decisions. This is the premise in which we need to support staff, and we need to begin to address for EDT workers of our well-being and how we go forward. On any given day, life can be hectic, juggling the balance between personal and professional. This unprecedented year have challenged our professional response to an increased demand on EDT services and impacting on some of us personally. Throughout this pandemic, we have continued to deliver our safeguarding services as well as responding to the additional vulnerabilities and welfare needs of our communities. As Ritu said earlier on, right at the beginning when sort of workers were doing video calls, you have to attend for a Mental Health Act assessment. You cannot do a Mental Health Act assessment remotely. And there's law supporting that you're unable to do that. This has taken many forms for EDT in terms of our responses, especially right at the beginning, such as there was an increase in providing telephone counseling support. Yes, EDT workers can provide telephone support to service users and families who were quite anxious and particularly who had where relatives were living far away and they needed that support. We will get calls to say, can you check on my father? Can this happen? We also were involved, as Ritu has mentioned, delivering food parcels, done in our PPE as if we were in a war zone, going into other environments like police stations where other people weren't using PPE. I mean, there was a shortage overall of PPE right at the beginning of the pandemic, so we need to take that into consideration as well. Now, we all know that our well-being can change from moment to moment, and over the past 12 months, buzzwords such as unprecedented, ventilators, transmission, incubation period, made us feel as if we were in a movie, the whole Contagion as sort of a movie. Then you had words such as heroes, agile, follow the rules, and coming together as a community, becoming part of all our everyday conversations. Depending on which side of the fence you were on, the emotions invoked by these words most certainly impacted on our physical and emotional or mental well-being. Now, the political ideology around community cohesion, whose focus was about economy and improving lives, had not really prepared our politicians for the impact of the need for coming together following the arrival of COVID-19. The foundation of such community cohesion relies on us as individuals having a sense of caring in order for there to be a sense of community. The very nature of EDT work means that caring is the foundation of what we do. And as A.J. D'Angelo said, this simple act is one of heroism as far as I'm concerned. We are all heroes. This survey has offered EDT practitioners the opportunity to reflect on the impact of the pandemic on their personal and professional well-being, which are intrinsically linked. So I've broken these down into 5 headings, and I want to look at the strengths and the resilience of EDT workers and EDT teams. I didn't want to start thinking, oh, this didn't happen or that didn't happen. I want us to focus on the strengths, and that needs to, I think our managers and senior managers need to be aware of that. So for resilience, in psychology, resilience means our ability to bounce back in the face of difficulties and challenges. However, resilience goes beyond this. Mind says it's also our capacity to adapt in the face of these challenging circumstances whilst maintaining a mental well-being. At the height of the pandemic, essential workers were seen as heroic. We soldiered on. However, not much thought was being given to the impact on workers' well-being and the fallout of what is now seen as PTSD, particularly within the medical world as well. Social distancing and self-isolation made us feel very anxious, frustrated, and at times made us bored. However, the simple act of regular routine can help us manage some of these feelings. But how easy is this for EDT workers? Lots of guidance around is addressing mainstream 9 to 5, debate of take a lunch break, get up from your desk and walk around. How easy is that for EDT workers if you start a shift and you are literally taking calls from the time you begin your shift to the time you end and then need to do all the recording? I've had examples of people sort of saying to me, I haven't had time to even go to the loo. So when we talk about taking a break, when we talk about go for a walk, it's not as easy for EDT workers. So how can us as EDT workers do that? How do we build and maintain resilience? We need to look at our physical health and our mental health as well, our mental well-being. We need to be physically healthy as possible. We need to try to eat a balanced diet. How well can we do that eating at 3 o'clock in the morning? We need to be more active. Can we go for a walk in the middle of the night? It's not, so where I'm saying a lot of the guidance around it's targeted for your normal 9 to 5 or what's seen as 9 to 5. That's the advice being given. I think most importantly, we need as EDT workers and as social workers, we need to start by understanding ourselves, understanding our thoughts, and understanding how this influences our response. So as Ritu has talked about at the beginning of the pandemic, some referrals rate went down, but others increased, and that was about the community. And we're part of that community. So we can't support the community without first looking at our own well-being as well. So we need to understand where we're coming from. I think as workers, we need to feel that we have the permission to take regular breaks away from the screen. We need to be able to say, we do not respond to the referrals for the next 5 minutes. Can we just leave the referrals coming into the inbox or the calls for 5 minutes? We need to be able to feel we have the permission to do that. I'm not saying as workers you don't respond, but feel that you can do that. Also use social media, the use of social media to communicate. I mean, most of us we've got the EDT managers WhatsApp group, and some teams I know have WhatsApp groups where even if you're in shift, you can text to the group. If someone is awake, they can respond. So use that level of support in terms of building sort of resilience and coping mechanism. And most of all, adequate rest and sleep are crucial in our recovery and our well-being. I mean, some of us do that within our rota pattern where that's built in. So I know for Harrow, the majority of workers have got a period, the rotas work in such a way that you have a decent break so you can recover, particularly if you've worked long weekends, you need to be able to recover. Now, if we were to look at the strengths of EDT, the majority of EDT workforce are usually experienced social workers, ex-team managers, and even heads of services, with an average team experience of 50+ years. I mean, I know in my team, it's probably about 100+ years in terms of work experience. As practitioners, we are reflective in our approach, which in itself is quite cathartic. And I think we do that sort of quite a lot. EDT workers have the ability to communicate and immediately recognize the wider impact of our intervention. It could be said that, It could be said that EDT workers are used to working in isolation and equally experienced in risk and decision making. Again, right at the beginning, it was when I've spoken to lots of other colleagues who struggled to work from home. We were used to working in isolation. We're used to being lone workers and looking at how we manage that. And I think within us, we build up our resilience in terms of how we're going to manage things like that, to manage being isolated. EDT social workers are also known to be creative whilst adhering to legal frameworks. However, COVID-19 added to the complexities of the referrals and thus increased the limitations of our responses. Again, we speak about one of the things Balfour and Deborah spoke about was Section 40 beds, repeat assessment, duplication of work, patients being seen 2 or 3 times before they progress to an admission, and the impact of that in terms of our limitations of how we can respond. The experienced workforce of EDT have at times found it harder to seek help as supportive networks are limited out of hours. So again, we've mentioned part of the survey about the number of people who did not have access to an on-call manager, but you will not be phoning an on-call manager to say, oh, I'm struggling, or I need I need some support. However, things like the WhatsApp support group, the WhatsApp group is one way of doing that as well. So we've created sort of support systems for ourselves. When we're looking at work-life balance, remote working is now embedded in our psyche, and the ability to do this has been both positive and negative. Survey responders report the opportunity to work from home afforded them the ability to allow time for utilizing the additional support needed in their caring responsibilities, with 65.4% of respondents working from home and 21.8% of respondents working hybrid, working from home and office. However, the lines between personal and professional boundaries could be blurred. One colleague described her dining table serving as her office, classroom for the children, and family meals. This surely is not an environment conducive to good well-being, as the ability to compartmentalize our lives is then diminished. Moreover, we need to be aware that not everyone has the ability to work remotely. There is some need for that human connection which cannot be gained via Zoom, Teams, or any other social platform. The survey findings on well-being, which I found of significant concern, is 40.8% of respondents felt their well-being had not been supported during the pandemic, and a further 55.9% reported that their well-being had decreased or significantly decreased since the start of the pandemic. At the time of the survey, no respondent had received any form of counselling. However, 41% had received additional supervision. 67.9% have had group supervision, and 39.7% received additional telephone support. Only 42.6% had received emotional support and practical support, with 89.8% reported that COVID-19 had made their role more challenging, and 67.7% completed risk assessment prior to visits. So one of the things Richard talked about is going into the community to do assessment. How many of us were doing risk assessments prior to going out? I know most authorities had a screen that you would look at and questions you would ask before you go out. But could we have asked those questions to our A&E colleagues before we go out? Could we ask those questions to the police before we go out? You go out to the police station to do an assessment, you're in a small room with 4 people, you weren't able to social distance. So it's about how did we feel able to challenge those things? And we'll come on to that later on in terms of recommendations. Okay, so the final bit is, for me, it's okay not to be okay. I heard the leader of our council sort of said that sort of a couple of weeks ago, and I thought, yes, it's okay not to be okay. Prior to March last year, the term social distance was unheard of. Now it's seen as a noun, as in social distance, and as an adjective, socially distant. Life in itself can be very hectic and have been even more so over the past year. In our attempts to get the right balance in our response, we sometimes forget to check in with ourselves as EDT workers. We sometimes forget to do that. We soldier on, we carry on, and we are delivering a service. If we're unable to do this, how well can we be doing that with others? So we need to start with ourselves. We need to start looking at our own well-being, check in with ourselves. There is a clear need for continued communication and check-ins with each other in order for us to continue to improving our well-being and delivering and responding well to our service users and our communities. And I had a quote from Maya Angelou, where she sort of said, if you have a situation and you can't change it, and you've tried to change it and you can't change it, you then change your attitude towards it. And I think as EDT workers, we have a lot of strengths, we have a lot of resilience as a workforce. And I think we are an example for daytime colleagues. They can learn from us, and I think we need to be very proud of that. Thank you very much. Right, we're going to move to the next slide, which is looking at minimum standards. Can we have the next slide, please? After this, thank you. Now, Rita and I are going to present this sort of area, looking at minimum standards for EDT and out of hours. And I know one of the things Linda has spoken about is the different names for services, and that will always be the case because each local authority is different. They have different needs and different priorities. But for all social workers, we're registered with Social Work England, thereby we're signed up to the professional standards listed by the Dutch registered body. However, we feel some consideration should be given to include CPD specifically for out-of-hours social work, akin to KPIs, our performance, how are we working, and how do we progress in terms of things around training. So employing local authorities and private providers need to ensure relevant bespoke training and professional development to equip the out-of-hours social workers in meeting the needs of its service users. I.e. local authorities can form EDT consortiums to address training around support needs. For some of you who've been around long enough, you will remember ESSA in terms of joint training, EDTs joining up and having a training budget and looking at specific training for EDTs. And I know training is available during the day, and in terms of our learning and development teams, that there is training, but some of those trainings need to be specific to EDT and the generic work we do, and actually learning from each other and our expertise. Okay, we have statutory obligations. Those have been covered by both Linda and Deborah and Balfour and Rebecca in terms of Local Social Services Act, Children Act, the Care Act, Housing Act, Mental Capacity Act, the Mental Health Act, and other statutory responsibilities. what we need to have clear, what we need is clear definition of what is an emergency and the remit of an out of hours service. I mean, I'm not quite sure how we can do that in terms of getting something like that nationally, but we need to actually be quite clear. What is the emergency? What are we responding to? What's going to be the outcome for that service user? As Balfour and Deborah spoke about, and Ritu, you do a mental health act assessment. Do you go at 2:30 in the morning to wake someone up to do an assessment? You can't resolve that piece of work because there are no beds. What then happens to patients? So it's about what we do and how we're going to do it. Can there be any minimum standards across the board to address that? And also we need to be looking at our work with other professional colleagues, that looking at the work we do with, say, the police and health. Do we have policies which needs to be embedded within our working pathways in terms of how we work, and actually about joint working? Of grave concern was the management support and legal advice out of hours. For 15.7% of respondents, they had no access to management support out of hours. We feel this needs to be 100%, and it should include access to heads of service from children, adults, and mental health services if possible. We are working in isolation, and if you do not have someone you can make contact with, you may have policies in place to say a manager has agreed for all police protection will be accommodated, but you still need to have some discussion with someone around that. If you're doing a complex mental health act assessment, you may need to have access to a manager who has some understanding of the Mental Health Act. 26.8% of respondents under 20 had access to legal sort of advice. Now, given the nature of what we do, and we're in a litigious society, we know we also having to not only have good practice, but also we need to consider the implications of our practice. It's very surprising that that's only less than 30% of workers had access to legal advice, to any form of legal advice. So again, we feel this needs to be a priority for local authorities to make sure that that service is available for EDT workers. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Ritu to complete the partner and agency protocols and after.
Thanks, Jennifer. I mean, I think we need to understand this is just a snapshot of what we actually looked into, and this is basically setting up a scene for further development across the local authorities of the EDT and out-of-hours services. But what we thought was that partner agencies and protocols out of hours cannot be developed without working together with our key partner agencies providing emergency services. Health, police, mental health trusts, and care providers are all vital in working with the local authorities on this agenda. It is therefore crucial for relationships with any of our partner agencies to be embedded in all care pathways. They need to be meaningful, they need to be deliverable. And I think I've been working for a long time without going into the numbers, but we do get a number of policies, but they need to be practical, they need to be operational, and the resources need to actually back them up. That if we say that two agencies are going to work in a particular way, both agencies equally need to resource their workforce to make it workable. There is further need to explore step-down services which have a role to play in both children in need services and for service users experiencing mental health crisis who fall short of meeting the threshold for assistance from statutory services. Because what happens is that if there is nothing else available to support people who are vulnerable, who are undergoing a crisis, then the fallback is on the statutory services. We end up doing mental health assessment when there are social issues with housing, with substance misuse, with domestic violence, because there isn't any other alternative service which can actually support them through that. Very crucial that we need to be actually looking at the staffing and the recognition and the pay structure of the out of hours worker. We need to ensure that the out of hours services adequately reflect the population size it's serving. We need to ensure the availability of the additional backup staff, the sessional staff, and the administrative support available to the frontline workers and the core team. The emergency duty team, as we actually set the title as the forgotten service, has stayed in the background for a long time. And I think it's very important that it's actually brought into the mainstream. It's recognized, if we see a typical day, which is of 24 hours, the day services are working for 8 hours and EDT is working for the 16 hours, the out of hour services. And we cover all the bank holidays and the, weekends. So, and it's actually representing a local authority for all the crisis services it's providing. So it is in the local authority's interest to actually have a workforce well-resourced, employing experienced and able professionals who can deliver the agenda of the local authority to its residents and anybody who is presenting with any risks, whether it's children or adults.
Oh, Ritu, absolutely hate to interrupt you because everything you're saying is so important. But just to say, if we could maybe wrap up in the next 30 seconds just to allow time for questions, that would be great.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm aware of the time, Becca. Thank you for reminding anyway. So day services need to develop robust care plans, including out of hours contingency arrangements, and a clear structure for communication between day and out of hours services need to be established. Any responses need to be timely and purposeful to ensure better outcomes for the service users and the residents of a borough. Although EDT and out-of-hours services are different in each local authority, there needs to be some consistency in responses to meet the expectations so the service users and other professionals are clear about what to expect. Then we need to have quality assurance and auditing in place. Daily and regular auditing of EDT referrals and contact case notes are essential in monitoring the quality of our responses and the meaningful outcomes for the service users. Data needs to be collected and analyzed to effect any meaningful changes to the resources to meet the demands of the service. What I understand is that there's been a recent development that London Safeguarding Board has taken an initiative to work on minimum standards for EDT and out of hours, and we look forward to working with it in terms of awaiting any recommendations to make our service better. And thank you. Sorry, Becca, if I went over.
No, thank you all so much. Hand on heart, I can say I wish that before I went into daytime services, I'd have had the opportunity to come to a webinar like this. I was so ignorant. I made so many assumptions. I had no idea it was often just one lone worker overnight. I really had no idea what the threshold was for referral. So I speak on behalf of everyone, I'm sure, when I say that was so useful. Very quickly before we go on to questions, if we could skip 2 slides ahead to the professional support service, that would be great. You've touched on well-being at the moment, and I think it's so important that anyone here who is struggling and who isn't feeling, as Jennifer was saying, okay, that it's okay to not to be okay, and it's great to reach out to support. So BASWA has developed this professional support service for members. It's a great opportunity to access peer support. It's led by and for social workers. It's a great opportunity for professional development and just space to really put yourself first. And if you go on to the next slide, anyone who's interested in becoming a BASWA member, we've put on a discount code specifically to people today, so feel free to take a photo of the discount code on your phones. We have everything from you know, insurance to trade union representation, legal advice, constant training and events, and it's a great way to really connect with social workers across the country at a time when people are feeling very isolated. We're also looking to build on the incredible work that the EDT London Managers Forum has done. So if you are interested in being part of a national EDT team, a focus group at BASWA that will work in partnership with the London EDT team to build on their recommendations and to, you know, continue to campaign for change to policy and practice, please do give us an email at england@baswa.co.uk. That email address will be popped in the chat very shortly, but that is more than enough from me. I can see there's loads of really interesting questions in the chat, so I'm going to go through them. So the first question is, going back all this way, there's so many questions. The first one is from, oh, it's not a question, it's a comment, just to say, hi, in Hertfordshire, where I work, we have a dedicated out of hours team for children and one for adults. So that's really interesting, that's in place. I'm going to move to the question from Balvinder, which is, what do people think about the move to MASH 24 mode? Anyone feel free to just put your hand up and go for it. Go on, Claire.
I think you have to be realistic about what you can do out of hours. Because lots of people don't work out of hours. So if you're in a MASH situation, you're relying on other agencies being available to give you information, and they may not be there. So I think you have to be realistic about what you can or can't find out. And equally to be clear about what the value of that will be for frontline practitioners, because it can be useful. A lot of what EDT social workers do is actually triaging and finding out information about situations to make judgments about how risky they are. So you could see this as an extension of that, but I think you just have to be realistic.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a great answer. Sarah, are you okay to maybe answer the next one? Yeah. So the next one is, I think it's a comment, but it's given that many EDT workers are close to retirement age and there being a challenge in finding AMP qualified social workers that have a background in children's social care, it seems inevitable that moving forward, the only way to ensure EDT can remain staffed is to separate adult and children's EDT services. Is that something you agree or disagree with, or any thought?
No, I think the AMP role should be extended to children's workers. Personally, I think, I mean, now we're not in CMHTs anymore. Even the adult workers that go for AMP training are now no longer in the CMHTs where they used to gain all their experience. So I don't see why children's workers shouldn't be given the experience of becoming an AMP. And then I think, you know, you could keep your generic services. I personally like the generic services. I think they're really useful. And I think it gives you, you know, a good helicopter view of what's going on in the borough. And, you know, so that's my preference. It's not everybody's. But I think instead of sort of restricting it, and she's quite right, we are all getting a bit old. But oh, so maybe not Balfour.
No, you all look gorgeous.
Oh, thank you, Sarah.
Sorry, go on, Balfour.
Can I just say,
thanks. I was just going to echo really what Sarah said, in terms of, I think we would, you know, ideally, generic workers is always I think is the preference. However, we also know that recruitment and retention is a huge challenge going forward, not just for EDT services, but day services also. And I think what we also need to think about is the social workers of tomorrow who are coming through training and will be coming through training at some point. They're all being directed towards specialisms really at the outset before the completion of their training. So even if our preference is for generic workers, the way that trainers, social workers of tomorrow are being trained, they're being directed towards specialisms anyway. So I would just echo what Sarah said as well in terms of children's services workers becoming AMPs. That's something that I'm particularly looking at as a focus going forward.
I think that's really important.
Sorry.
Sorry?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I think Deborah had a hand up.
Yeah, just to say that's something that we're looking at in Lambeth at the moment. But I think there's also a need for a shift in terms of making placements and adults available for the children's social workers to do the shadowing, and also to have a dialogue with the universities that require significant, I think it's about 2 years experience with adult work. So I think it's achievable, and I look forward to that.
Right, going to go on to the next question. Sorry, go on, Sarah, quickly.
I was just going to say, but the culture, I mean, to say that children's workers don't work with adults with mental health problems, I think is a bit of a fallacy, because a lot of the parents they're working with now actually have severe mental health problems. So I think that's a bit of a myth, really.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Really interesting. We're going to be recording this webinar so everyone can really make use of your answers. I'm going to quickly rush through the next question. So this one's really interesting. Someone said, I recently suggested we provide a quarterly newsletter around Essex ECC. It was accepted, but not with any enthusiasm. Do you think it might be a good way to get the EDT messages out? Or more work than rewards? Just to say at BASWA, if that's something people would find helpful, would be happy to kind of circulate that. But yeah, over to Sarah or Deborah, what do you think?
I think it's Sarah.
I just think, and I think we really do now have to sort of propel forward, because I'm very concerned at a lot of the things that are going on. You know, as we've mentioned all through the webinar, the lack of shortage of beds, and the fact that the impact it has, but we never take it anywhere. I feel that we sort of get so far, and I think we do need to have someone that can take our issues forward and get everyone to see them. You know, I mean, my biggest bugbear is, you know, we're not an extension of any one day service, because how can you be one worker mopping up the whole of social services? But yet we are an extension of the mental health services by default, because there are no beds. So we get handed over 4 or 5 assessments and high. And so we are an extension, but yet so culturally that's shifted. And we really need now to be thinking the day services are no longer fit for purpose, because all the work's coming in now out of hours. I mean, I don't know how it happens, but there's a little bed ferry that comes around at 2:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
There's a bed free, and you have to go and see that person. I mean, that's inhumane, but that's now accepted practice, that we'll go and wait till the bed becomes available at 2:30 in the morning. We're expected to go and wake them up and shift them over to a bed. I mean, you wouldn't do that in any other medical profession, and there is no parity of esteem.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm very quickly going to move on to the next one because time's running out. Isabel has said, I never hear about EDT, which proves your point. Interesting that it does not get a major profile, possibly because you're doing a good job, so it's not senior management's worry list. Incredible expertise and complexity of work. Are there any regional EDT arrangements in England? I'll go on to the next. Sorry, go on, Claire.
I was going to say, I think there are in some areas. So I think ESSA in the West Midlands, the group there may have survived. And also, there are, like, I think in the North East, they've actually got a more regional arrangement in terms of how they provide their service. It's very ad hoc. And it would be, it's a shame, because I think there's a lot of expertise. And I always think that EDTs are a bit like the canary in the coal mine. We will often see things starting to go wrong early. So it's always worth listening if your EDT colleagues start saying, hang on a minute, I'm really concerned about this. We're seeing a lot of it. Because if we're seeing it now, you're probably going to see it very quickly as well.
Thank you so much, Claire. We've got time for one. If we could just keep this response under 20 seconds, that would be great. What has changed significantly over the last 5 years in terms of the kind of referrals you receive?
The amount. And certainly in Wandsworth, the amount of referrals we've received have trebled, and I'm sure
But
that's
also,
the same for Deborah.
I think the other one I'd say is the focus on referrals of children who are absent from their placements that come through us, and I really don't know that that's purposeful, because it's not, and it ties up a lot of our time, it ties up a lot of police time, and I think we need to think about different ways of doing that.
I would say that we're also the nature of the referrals. We're getting more serious referrals in relation to youth violence, for instance. County lines is also another factor. So yes, some really serious safeguarding referrals are coming through.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so sorry, Jennifer, because I really want to hear from you. If we could literally keep it to 10 seconds, then we are going to have to end at past. Go on, Jennifer.
No, Deborah has said it. I think over the last 5 years has been the complexities of referrals, and as sort of Deborah said, it is that bit of VV, CSC, the whole complexities, and a lot of things happens out of hours. And we need to remember out of hours are when families are together, so the issues are arising more sort of out of hours.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid I'm going to have to end it there. But do continue the conversation with us. We'd love you to join BASWA. We'd love you to join a national EDT group that really puts the focus and the heart on back onto this service that is so, so important but undervalued and misunderstood a lot of the time. We're going to have to end there. Have a wonderful afternoon, and I hope to see some of you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.